Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, Director of Roosevelt House at Hunter College, and on behalf of President Jennifer Raab, who just hosted an event with Nancy Pelosi and Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. I'm exhausted. I don't know how she does it or they do it, but I'm exhausted. Welcome to the fourth event of the day here at Roosevelt House, and we're excited to see you. Let me first acknowledge and welcome a very special guest, Congressman Jerry Nadler. Anyway, I want to, as I have been doing for the last few weeks, acknowledge in these last few days of President Raab's 22-year tenure at Roosevelt House, I want to take a moment at the beginning of each program to acknowledge what she's meant, not only to Hunter, but to all of us who gather here at Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's home for public programs. 13 or 14 years ago, this house was beyond in disrepair. It was crumbling. And when she got here, she had a choice of either cashing in on the real estate opportunity for a one-shot boost in difficult times, or finding a way to save, finance, restore, rehabilitate, and repurpose this place, down to creating this auditorium space by taking 2 floors of soil out in wheelbarrows. This is the result, and I am so grateful. We should all be so grateful to her pioneering work and her great work. So just a round of applause for Jennifer. I hope, by the way, that when you go upstairs for our reception, which, thanks to our special guest, will include sushi, I hope that in your race for the sushi, you will also have a look at the exhibition that we have on now that describes and illustrates the restoration of Roosevelt House. There are some great images. Well, tonight we welcome 2, I was going to say old friends, longtime friends, and great colleagues back, and it's a true honor to introduce them. Joining us to debut his brand new book, this is its publication day, is the extraordinary Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik, who is the rabbi at Congregation She'ereth Israel on the west side, the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States, and by legend, and I embrace it, and I'm the final word, the first synagogue in the United States to offer Kaddish for a non-Jew, in this case Abraham Lincoln. So that's what linked us together, no pun intended, and that's how we became friends. We are thrilled to have him back. I don't know how the rabbi does all he does. In addition to leading a congregation, he hosts 2 podcasts, Bible 365 and Jerusalem 365. I don't know if one has ended and another has begun. It's still extraordinary. Both of them amazing as guided tours, as those of you who know him can imagine. And he also serves as director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, where he received his rabbinic ordination before earning a PhD in religion from Princeton. I had the honor of co-teaching with him at Yeshiva and at Cardozo Law School, and they were exciting, stimulating experiences for us, and I hope for the students. And if there's an explanation for my taking my time with its introduction, it's because, as you can imagine, I barely got a word in at Yeshiva or Cardozo. But it was still fun to listen to him. The new book, as you see, I've put it up there, is Providence and Power. And the subtitle you see, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship. We may not get to all 10 tonight, though I encourage you all to buy copies at our debut book signing for the book afterwards at a reception. As I said, the rabbi is sponsoring with sushi, and it's co-sponsored as well by the Hunter Center for Jewish Studies. The chapters range from the biblical David to Disraeli, Herzl, Louis Brandeis, into the modern era of Ben-Gurion and Begin. I know we will all be treated to something unique and memorable with the opportunity to explore this history through the eyes and mind of such a brilliant and thought-provoking interpreter. We are, as I mentioned, grateful to the Jewish Studies program, not only for the refreshments, but more particularly to its director, Dr. Leah Garrett, the Larry and Clara Silverstein Chair in Jewish Studies at Hunter, and the Director of Jewish Studies and Hebrew. Her own terrific books include X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II, which we featured here at Roosevelt House and on C-SPAN, and the prize-winning Young Lions, How Jewish Authors Reinvented the American War Novel. So this should be an amazing conversation. There will be a discussion of about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And for your questions, Dr. Garrett will call on you, but please, I know you all have wonderful speaking voices, but wait for the microphone because we want our Zoom audience to hear all of the questions that you might pose. And then we'll proceed to our reception and book signing. And with that, it's a great privilege to introduce Rabbi Meir Soloveichik in conversation with Dr. Leah Garrett on Providence and Power.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And just to reiterate what Harold said about President Jennifer Raab, it's been such an honor, honestly, to have been hired by her, to work with her, and to have at Hunter such a fierce and proud and important defender of Jewish students. And I'm just very delighted that in her last month here, we get to do this event as well. So I usually don't bring a list of questions, but I had so many questions. I want to keep a bit organized here. So we're gonna, as Harold said, we're gonna talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So first, if you want to tell us briefly about your book, because it did just come out for those who have not yet read it, and then I'll ask you a series of questions around it.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank you, Dr. Garrett. It was a joy first meeting you, and Lalies and I went out with you, along with the Goldbergs who are here, and I'm so delighted to be engaged in this conversation with you. I want to thank my very dear friend Harold, who has been such a blessing in my life, for immediately when he heard about the book, offering to host an event around it. And I'm, of course, delighted to recognize the presence of the incredible Neil Kazadoy, who has been my editor in so many realms for so many years, as well as in this book as well. I want to also join with you, Dr. Garrett, and with Harold in celebrating the incredible Jennifer Raab and her legacy in academia and as a genuine leader in standing up for the Jewish people. It's such a great privilege to mark all that she has done for Hunter in general and for Roosevelt House in particular, and for the Jews of New York and for the United States. And so I'm honored to be able to take part in this event during her tenure. The topic of the book is Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship. And what it attempts to do is to study the lives of really 11 different significant political figures in Jewish history. It's 10 portraits. The final one involves 2 people. It's a contrast between Ben-Gurion and Begin. And it seeks to understand the lives and the uniquely Jewish inspiration and motivation behind the achievements of King David, Queen Esther, Queen Shlom Tzion of the Second Temple period, Yochanan ben Zakkai, Abarbanel, or Abravanel, as some pronounce it, Don Isaac Abravanel, Menachem ben Israel, Benjamin Disraeli, Louis Brandeis, and Theodore Herzl, and then finally Ben-Gurion and Begin. And what it seeks to do is not only to study their lives, but attempt to deduce from what they have in common, while of course noting the differences, what is Jewish statesmanship, and what sets it apart from statesmanship or statecraft in general. That's the goal of the book. What does it mean to be a Jewish statesman? What does the Jewish people or Judaism or Jewish history ask of a Jewish political leader? That's really the goal that we seek to answer here. That's really the question that we seek to answer here in this book.
And what was it about this particular time period that made you want to write this book and write it now?
Yeah, so the inspiration for the book actually in part began when I started, when I had the great blessing of teaching the course that Harold mentioned. We taught together, as he mentioned, a class on Lincoln's statesmanship, and we followed it chronologically. And the small role that I played was to work on the impact that the Bible may have had on Lincoln's statesmanship. And it struck me as we taught this class, and we were able to teach it both in the men's school, undergraduate school, the women's undergraduate school, yeshiva, and then in a slightly different version at Cardozo, is I began to ponder why I had never really taught a course that focused on the life of Jewish statesmen. And really, what texts existed that actually described the statesmanship or the statecraft of Jewish political leaders. There are biographies of course, certain modern Jewish political figures. But beyond that, there wasn't much. And I began to ask myself why that was so. And I think part of the answer is, or at least this is what I came to, and I mentioned this in the introduction to the book, is that even though the Jewish intellectual corpus is so broad and actually astonishing in its breadth. It covers throughout the centuries, it covers law and philosophy and theology and mysticism and biblical exegesis and so much else. There are two lacunae. One of them is biography. In the history of the West, really from the classical period on, there have been studies of great political and religious figures. So we have Plutarch's Lives, for example, and then in the realm of memory, or in the realm of autobiography, we have, say, Augustine's Confessions. There was a great Talmudic scholar, modern Talmudic scholar, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who also studied literature at Harvard. And one of the things he said is that, speaking about the great Boswell's great Life of Samuel Johnson, speaking about the Jewish intellectual corpus, he said, "Our Johnsons have no Boswells." And as an example, he gave the case of the great rabbinic sage Rabbi Akiva, who lived and led in the 2nd century CE, and then took part in the Bar Kokhba, in the failed Bar Kokhba rebellion. And according to the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva was an ignorant shepherd until he was 40. And then his life was changed by the inspiration of a woman, Rachel, who loved him and whom he loved in return. And so what Rav Lichtenstein said is, imagine if we had a Confessions from Rabbi Akiva that described his life, the way and the challenges he faced, the way we have an autobiography from Augustine describing his path, his spiritual path. I mean, you can imagine it today. Imagine if Rabbi Akiva today started as an itinerant shepherd at the age of 40 and then became a great rabbi thanks to his wife. They'd write a best-selling memoir. They'd go on Oprah together, probably, to tell about his life. Oprah could give everyone a free Talmud. You get a Talmud, and you get a Talmud, and you get a Talmud. And it would be, but we have nothing. We have incredible legal rulings from him, and we have here and there stories about his life in the Talmud, the way the Talmud tells stories. But we don't have a systematic description of his life. That's one lacunae. The other lacunae is political texts. We have incredible philosophical works written throughout Jewish history. And aside from the Bible, of course, which is a profoundly political work, after that, what we don't have is texts of political thought. We don't have a Jewish version of Machiavelli's The Prince, which would be very different if there were a Jewish version than Machiavelli's The Prince. We don't have Jewish works on statecraft, perhaps because of Jewish powerlessness, or perhaps because the Jewish mind throughout the centuries focused on other subjects. But studies in statesmanship are not really part of the larger corpus of Jewish thought. There are exceptions. I'm speaking in generalities. both about biography and about politics. And perhaps had Maimonides had access in Arabic to Aristotle's politics, the way he had access to Aristotle's metaphysics and ethics, maybe he would have written more significantly on political thought, but he didn't. And so I thought that this was a gap that I could at least humbly begin to fill with this book, to study great Jewish political lives and to attempt to deduce from their lives what is Jewish statesmanship itself.
So this is a non-humble question.
Yeah.
And then
I'm a very humble person, so it's going to be hard for me to answer it. Yeah.
Having gone through the journey of writing this book and contemplating this for a while, what to you makes for great Jewish political leaders?
Yeah. So here is I note several different aspects of great Jewish political leadership, but the first one also can be seen actually with Lincoln, because one of the things that came up in the course we taught together was a virtue that Lincoln exemplifies that very few great statesmen throughout the history of the West ever reflected, and that is humility. Now, what do we mean by humility? We don't mean a sense of one's nothingness, but rather the remarkable nature of Lincoln's life, especially during the Civil War, is that he is constantly making these incredible decisions, and yet is also reflecting in both public statements and in private musings a feeling that he's part of some larger divine plan that he doesn't fully understand. He has a line somewhere where he says, after writing a famous letter, and Harold will know to whom it was written, but he has a famous letter where he's describing one of the most extraordinary things that a statesman has ever done, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was very daring. And then after explaining his whole decision, why he did it and when he did it, he said something like, I want to also add that it is not I who have controlled events, but events who have controlled me, which seems like a very strange thing to say, because he is, of course, a great political actor, one of the great political actors. When I was speaking about, and I was thinking about this, so I asked my friend, my other historian friend, the British historian Andrew Roberts, when we were talking about Churchill, whether he could think of any great European statesman that had humility. And he couldn't name one. He couldn't name one. You know, Churchill was a great man, but no one would ever describe him as humble. He actually got into a fight with his butler, and then he said to his butler, "You were very rude to me." And his butler said, "Yes, but you were very rude to me." So he said, "Yes, but I am a great man." And yet, rightly understood, and that really is why I chose the title that I did, Power and Providence and Power, is that at the heart of at least the ideal of biblical Jewish leadership, not everyone discussed in the book exemplifies this feature at all times in their lives. At the heart of biblical leadership is to maintain this dialectic, to not be passive in any way, but at the same time to feel that you are part of a larger plan that you cannot fully understand. And the greatest sign that you are part of this larger plan is the extraordinary, miraculous nature of Jewish history itself. When I was asked what should be on the cover, one of the images that I had thought of before we decided not to have any image was a photograph that was taken of Menachem Begin at Camp David during the Camp David negotiations, playing chess with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Actual chess. It's a metaphor. I chose not to do it because I didn't know how many people would remember Zbigniew Brzezinski today from a picture. They had thought that he and Begin would have a lot in common because they were both from Poland. That's actually why they put them together. And I think it was Begin's chief of staff that joked that they were poles apart. But as I say in the book, really the challenge of Jewish leadership is to simultaneously play three-dimensional chess, which is the essence of statesmanship, and yet to feel at the same time that you are a mere pawn in a larger story. And to believe both in the importance of Jewish power, but also in the mysterious plan of providence. And if there are those in the book, like Brandeis, who really never thought that much about providence. The case I make in discussing their stories is that actually their remarkable lives are one of the greatest signs of providence itself, because their stories are so unlikely, in, at least as far as their role in Jewish history is concerned. That's true about Brandeis, and that's, of course, especially true of Theodore Herzl.
And it's interesting you mentioned Andrew Roberts. A very side point, because I'm a huge Andrew Roberts fan, because I work a lot on World War II, and of all the great World War II historians, he is the greatest, because he was the World War II historian. When he wrote about World War II, he refused to bifurcate the Holocaust out of the narrative.
Yeah.
So whenever he talks about World War II, unlike all the other historians who talk just about that, he always brings in what's happening to the Jews during the Holocaust. So
Yes.
And he said very important statements about Israel too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he notes how how Churchill's own, he makes the case actually that the fact that Churchill was one of the few in his conservative circles that actually liked Jews made him more sensitive to the rise of Hitler than others.
And he writes about it.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about who you selected to include, because when I got the book, my first thought was that I had a list in my head of who I would see, and I was thinking, of course, I'm going to see Golda Meir. I don't see Golda Meir. I see Esther. So if you could talk about this sort of process of selection of picking these as the ones you wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So the question about Esther is a really good question, and why I chose her. One might think, well, would one really choose someone who was, dragged to the palace by a very vulgar king, and who faced one single choice that we read about in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, as an embodiment of statesmanship? And why would you pick her over some other candidates who clearly wielded power more independently and for a longer period of time than she did? And the answer is, I think, that I make the case that not only is Esther a significant political figure, but that in a real sense, Jewish statesmanship is born with her. I argued this in an op-ed in the New York Times about Esther as well. And what I mean by that is the following. Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik has noted that what sets the book of Esther apart from the other books of the Bible is that this is really the first one where not only is the voice of God silent, God doesn't appear in the book, but that reflects a larger point, which is that prophecy is coming to an end here. And so what is politics throughout much of the Bible? Much of the Bible, whenever politics comes up, is the king is told by the prophet, you should do this. And then usually, after the king doesn't do that, the king is then asked by the prophet, why didn't you do that? The prophet will, in astonishing acts of fearlessness, will walk into the throne room and say, thus saith the Lord. Nathan walks into David's throne room after his sin with Bathsheba and accuses him. Right there. Elijah, to speak of, confronts a much more wicked king, Ahab, and confronts him. Shall you murder and also inherit? But that also means that the right course is always there. You are told what to do. Esther is the first character in the Bible who not only faces a question of what to do without any spiritual advice, she actually rejects the sole advice that she gets, which is from her cousin Mordecai. There is a decree against the Jews, and if you can summon the imagination to believe it, there is a regime in Persia that is hostile to the Jewish people, and the Jews are targeted for genocide. And Mordecai, her cousin, who is clearly a member of the larger court of the king, tells her to do what a prophet would do, to storm into the throne room and weep and cry and plead for her people. And Esther essentially says, and even though Mordecai is the one who inspires her to action, she, as Rabbi Soloveichik points out, she doesn't take his advice. She basically says, I'm not going to do that because Achashverosh, the king, is a mercurial man who doesn't want to be embarrassed and acts very suddenly, like our friend Joseph Stalin over here, who, just for the camera, is not our friend. And if she walked in and said, I've been lying to you this whole time, I'm actually Jewish, please save my people, it would have ended up with her dead as well. And what she does is she actually practices realpolitik and creates a set of situations in which she knows the man that she is seeking to persuade. She plays on his paranoia, turns him against his vizier, Haman, by inviting the three of them, all three of them, to get together for a romantic dinner for three, which is akin to a wife inviting her husband and her husband's best friend for a 50th wedding anniversary dinner, turns him against him, and then at the right moment strikes. And I think she is the first independent political actor in the Bible, and therefore in Jewish history. So I think she's actually the inventor, as it were, of Jewish politics as we know it. And so that's why I give her the credit that I seek to give.
And just to follow up on that,
Yeah.
if you could unpack a bit more sort of broadly about if you think there's things about the Jewish experience or Jewish religion that lend actors the ability to be very good statesmen and stateswomen.
Yeah. So, of course, there is first and foremost the feeling of the responsibility that Providence may have placed upon one. The most famous statement, perhaps, of the book is what Mordechai says to Esther: "Mi odea im la'et kazot higat lamalchut." Who knows? But perhaps for this moment, you came to the throne. And there are, of course, moments throughout Jewish history like this, where so much weighs on a single moment. Of course, we don't always know when that moment is. And so Judaism wants us to be constantly aware that a single decision that we make can have repercussions far beyond that which we can that we might actually realize. One of the stories I love to talk about, though doesn't fit in the book because this is not a statesman, is of course the story of Eddie Jacobson, the man who I see Congressman Nadler nodding, and so thank you so much for coming, Congressman Nadler, and it's one of the great stories. I'm happy you like it as well. This is everybody. Eddie Jacobson was, of course, the man who happened to be running the canteen with Lieutenant Truman during World War I. And then they go into a failed haberdashery business together. And it's only because that haberdashery business, the canteen did really well. Truman wrote to Bess, "I have a Jew helping me to run my canteen, and he is crackerjack." As David McCullough notes, as if that's like his sole resume recommendation to run the canteen. And it fails. Truman becomes part of, the political machine. And of course, they stay friends. And at a critical moment, when Chaim Weizmann is desperate to meet with Truman because Marshall wants to undo the partition plan, it's Eddie Jacobson that gets him in the door. Someone who came from Missouri, a Jew, once said to me something like, if Eddie Jacobson had treated Truman badly in that haberdashery business, there might not be a state of Israel today. And of course, the story is both a story of individual actors who seize the moment that Providence has placed for them. But it is, of course, a story of Providence as well. The two of them are together in World War I. FDR is on his train to the 1944 Democratic Convention, and he says, they ask him, "Who do you want to be your vice president?" And he says, "I don't know, maybe Douglas, maybe Truman." And at least according to one version of events cited by McCullough, the head of the Democratic National Committee has that written up, but tells the secretary to switch Truman and Douglas and put Truman first, so that letter will be handed out at the Democratic National Convention. How can you not believe in providence? And so to constantly, if you are aware of providence, then you are aware of moments that may define your entire legacy. And that's a theme that, of course, runs throughout the Bible, but I attempt to find it throughout Jewish history.
Thank you. And I was thinking when you were discussing these different figures, and I'm going to dive more deeply into some of them in a second. I was thinking when I wrote my book about Jewish commandos, when I started the journey of writing that book, I cared very deeply for all the men I was writing about because they were incredibly heroic and interesting. But then over the year or two it took to write the book, by the time I got to the end of it, there were some that I was just so fond of, and they felt like they were part of my family, and had that kind of impact on me, living with them, thinking about them, writing about them for a year. And I'm wondering, when you went through this, were there any particular figures that, as you ended the book, you thought that they had become sort of part of you, part of your family? You felt that very deep, unexpected connection with them, and why?
Yeah, so when I, of course, wrote the book originally, I knew I would end with Menachem Begin, because Menachem Begin is a hero of mine. My friends think that my next podcast will be Menachem Begin 365, a daily podcast about the life of Menachem Begin. And I also own Menachem Begin socks, which I wear as often as possible, and are a treasured possession of mine. But the figure that I knew, there are two figures that I wrote about, one that I did not know that much about until I started researching that person. And then there was one that I had known a lot about, but had not thought about the Jewish legacy as much. The latter was Benjamin Disraeli, who was impossible, I think, not to like, though of course his Jewish identity is extremely complex, and we should talk about that separately. So we'll talk about that. And then there is a woman who is mentioned in this book and is discussed in a chapter, who I think very few Jews know about, and that's the Second Temple Queen, Shlom Tzion. Shlom Tzion is her most important legacy, and this is very important for me as a student of royalty. Shlom Tzion is the only queen regnant in Jewish history. She reigned as an independent queen, not because she was married to the king, though she was married at one point to the king. Aside from the biblical figure Atalia, who usurped the throne, and who everyone in my family knows to call Atalia the usurper. But Shlom Tzion, you have to imagine, we know so little about who she was before she became queen. But we do know this. She marries a Hasmonean king at the time when the Hasmonean dynasty has fallen to fratricidal rage and hatred. She marries a man who kills, I think, one of his brothers and puts the rest in prison. That husband dies. She then, in levirate marriage, marries one of the other brothers, and she chooses who she's going to marry. And she is so clearly remarkable that when that king is dying, even though they have two sons who really are meant to succeed them, he appoints her as the independent ruler. And those 9 years are seen by the Talmud that she reigned as really the sole golden age of the entire Second Temple period. Second Temple period, of course, was largely not one in which there was an independent Jewish government. There was a brief monarchy under the Hasmoneans before it fell to Rome. And those 9 years, where she's working side by side with the Pharisaic leader Shimon ben Shetach, are seen by the Talmud as a golden age. And she's both, the subject is incredibly alluring because she's the one that we know the least about, and yet she is beloved by Rabbinic Judaism. She's probably the most beloved woman in the Talmud, and certainly the most celebrated, and certainly one of the most celebrated political figures in the Talmud. It's actually hard to think of a political figure post the Bible that is loved more, male or female, in the Talmud more than Shlom Tzion. And so I tried to piece together, based just on what we know from the Talmud and from Josephus, who's not as big a fan of her as the Talmud, what do we know about her, and what is her legacy? And her legacy today is just that she has a street named after her in Jerusalem, Actually, the street was originally named after, as royalty aficionados would know, the street was named after George V's wife, Queen Mary, because that was when the Balfour Declaration, their reign, the Balfour Declaration took place. But Israel decided that even though they would keep Rehov HaMelech George, they did keep King George Street, they changed Queen Mary Street to a Jewish queen. So they chose the one Jewish queen regnant in Jewish history. And her partner, the Talmud refers to him as her brother, Shimon ben Shetach. The two streets intersect in Jerusalem. And it's in their honor that some of the best restaurants in Jerusalem are planted right there. The greatest honor that Jews can bestow is the restaurants there. But aside from that, if you asked anybody, who is this Shlom Tzion and why is a street named after her? Unless you're a student of the Talmud, you would know, and even if you are a student of the Talmud, you would just know that the rabbis like her a great deal. But why? And so I'm a huge fan of Shlom Tzion, and the book gave me the opportunity to really research. The book, which began as lectures at the Tikva Fund, gave me the opportunity to really research her life to the best of my ability.
So Disraeli.
Yeah.
So I teach Hunter undergraduate students courses on modern Jewish culture, American Jewish culture. Always we discuss what makes someone Jewish. Last semester I taught Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger.
Yeah.
As a Jewish novel. His mother was Jewish, he was Jewish. He served it. And the students really pushed back against it. And I taught Kafka too. And Disraeli, of course, was baptized. And it's a very interesting choice. And I'm always so interested when we make these choices, in particular in regards to putting him within this incredible pantheon of Jewish statesmen.
Yeah.
How you selected him, what's Jewish about it, and how you look at it.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite subjects, and I read a lot of British biographies of British statesmen, and there are, of course, a lot of books about Disraeli. Most of them do not focus heavily on his Jewishness. One does, and I'm so delighted to recognize the author of that book, which is Adam Kirsch, who wrote an amazing book on Disraeli. I'm sorry? Yeah, you're welcome. But thank you. And that, I had read that long before I worked on this book, but it had stuck in my mind. Without, if I can have the chutzpah to quote Adam for a second, one of Adam's theses, I think, is that Disraeli, rather than seeking to renounce his Jewishness, actually made pride in his Jewish heritage a centerpiece of his entire political, political status in Britain. I think the way Adam describes it is that Disraeli took the aspect of himself which could have been his greatest political weakness and turned it into a strength. I think Adam calls it Jiu-Jitsu. I think is what I think he calls it. And that's exactly what he did. It's all the more remarkable, though, because Disraeli's father, who, of course, left the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community in England because they had the chutzpah to ask him to serve as one of the presidents or to serve on the board of the congregation. I'm burying the part that the rule there was that if you refuse to serve after being asked, you have to pay a fine. You get fined for not serving on the board. And so he just left. But the amazing thing about Disraeli is that his father, Isaac Disraeli, was really a self-hating Jew. And he wrote a work called The Genius of Judaism, in which his thesis was that Jews have wasted the Jewish intellect on silly things like the Talmud, like rabbinic Judaism, that their lives were a waste. And the irony is that he clearly, in baptizing his 12-and-a-half-year-old son at just a few months before his son's bar mitzvah, he was clearly preparing his son to be a fully assimilated Englishman. And yet, what he was creating was a prime minister who, because he was baptized, would be able to actually take part in the parliament. And yet would not only place at the heart of his political identity, his Jewishness. But he would go out of his way to remind Britain and the entire West what they owed the Jews. So famously, in the debate about letting Jews into Parliament, at a time when the entire rest of the Conservative Party, except for one other member, was against allowing Jews into Parliament, and the Whigs, the other party, Palmerston's party, were in favor, Disraeli gave a speech arguing that Jews should be let into Parliament, but not based just on equal rights, which is, of course, a pretty good argument in itself, but based on what Christianity owes Judaism. And as he turned, you have to imagine him, this very Jewish-looking young man at the time, standing in Parliament and having the chutzpah as a baptized Jew to say, and he literally says these words, "Where is your Christianity, if not for their Judaism?" And then he goes on to write this strange and fascinating novel, among others, Tancred, about a Christian aristocrat who journeys to the Holy Land and goes to Mount Sinai and is told that basically all of the world needs the revelation of Sinai that the Jews gave to the world. So if someone's running if someone's trying to work his way, as Disraeli put it, up the greasy pole, you wouldn't necessarily recommend to write a novel like that. But he did. And so what that means is that whatever his views about God and providence were, and it's really not clear, and actually the next biography that Andrew Roberts is going to be publishing on he'll be publishing a biography in 2026 on Disraeli, actually. So I'm excited about that. But what he did have was a deep sense of what the West owed the Jewish people. And perhaps even more importantly, he had a deep sense of foreboding about what would happen to the West if they cut themselves off from the Hebraic biblical moral message. And that's why, by placing that at the very center of his political identity, he deserves to be recognized and analyzed as a Jewish statesman.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions.
Sure.
And then we'll open it up. So can you talk with us about Herzl and Brandeis and sort of what they offer us about the complexities of Jewish identity, particularly in terms of the American and the European context?
Yeah. So each one is a story that really on its own doesn't make much sense. Herzl, of course, is whose Zionist story more people know, is a man who lives an assimilated Jewish life in Vienna and then as a journalist in Paris, and is suddenly seized by a deep sense of the anti-Semitism in Europe, not, as most people think, because of the Dreyfus Affair, but as others note, really because of the election of Karl Lueger, Hitler's hero, as mayor of Vienna. But he suddenly gets into his head that he is going to create this movement. Now, there were Zionists, of course, before Herzl, but Herzl makes statesmanship the centerpiece of Zionism. He creates a Zionist Congress, and he says, if you want us to be recognized as a people with political aims, we have to act like that. We have to be able to come into the courts of kings and emperors and popes and speak on behalf of the Jewish people. But remember, this is a man who goes, when he's seized with the idea of the Jewish state and publishes the Jewish state, he speaks to the chief rabbi of Vienna. Chief rabbi of Vienna comes to see him, and he finds that there's a Christmas tree in Theodor Herzl's house. That's where he was at this point. That's where he was. And then he begins this mysterious journey and then dies, a couple of years into the 20th century. But he writes in Basel as he's sitting in that hotel room, and you can all stay in the same hotel room where he stayed. It's called the Herzl River Room. I have a deep interest in hotels, and so I'm happy to tell you the Herzl River Room has a minibar and Swedish technology, and he writes in there, in Basel I created the Jewish state, and people may not know it, but in 5 years or in 50 years everyone will see it, and then essentially the state of Israel comes into being 50 years later. So his story, and I examined the source of his feelings about his Jewishness. But the argument I ultimately make is that, again, only Providence explains this story. People often attempt to argue the opposite, that the fact that Zionism comes from a man who had emerged as something so secular, as someone so secular, that you can draw the opposite conclusion. But that's not my view. I often quote, there was a Jewish philosopher at Columbia who said, who was well known as an atheist, and then at the end of his life, when he was suffering, he said something like, "Why is God doing this to me? Just because I don't believe in him?" Okay, and part of the incredible story of Herzl is that actually, as he describes in a less well-known piece of writing than the Jewish State, a short story that he wrote called The Menorah, is that the Jewish State was only the beginning of his journey, and he came to discover his Jewishness and to marvel at the mystery of Jewish existence. Now, Brandeis is fascinating because he's in a certain sense the opposite. He not only grew up with no Jewishness whatsoever, he never really embraced Judaic identity, and certainly not Jewish observance. He was cremated at the end of his life, Brandeis, and he and his brother used to send each other, I'm not making this up, Christmas hams. Hams for Christmas. Not just hams, but hams for Christmas. That's what they would send that to each other. And there's letters, I think, where he writes, "I'm really looking forward to the Christmas ham this year," in maybe the least Jewish sentence that one could ever possibly write. Except for maybe, "I'm not hungry." This is a man who grows up in Louisville with assimilated Jewish parents. And even way, way back, if you trace back, he comes from not traditional Jews. He's a descendant of Frankists, which were these strange Sabbatian sect of Jews. And he descends from those Jews. That's Louis Brandeis. But he has one exposure to Jewish observance, which is his uncle, Louis Dembitz. And he later changed his name to include Dembitz. The Louis D. Brandeis is Louis Dembitz Brandeis. And what made Dembitz fascinating, he was a lawyer in Louisville, is that he wasn't only, first of all, he was someone who was a prominent Republican in the 1860s and was involved in the campaign to elect Lincoln president, was a prominent anti-slavery spokesman in Kentucky, which was not the usual. And he was also an incredibly observant Jew. I cite in the book a eulogy or an obituary written for him in the prominent non-Jewish Louisville paper about what an incredible American he was, but also what an observant Jew he was. How he didn't do any business on Shabbat. He wouldn't even open letters on Shabbat. Or as the paper put it, on his Sabbath, he could always be found at his local church. And as I describe in the book, Brandeis was convinced that to truly be an American, one must essentially amputate your Jewish identity from yourself. He was fond of quoting the TR phrase that we don't need hyphenated Americans. We don't need hyphenated Americans, which is, and he meant that when he said that as a warning to the Jews who were coming from Eastern Europe, immigrating, that they needed to shed all that made them strange. I always said that whenever I see that phrase, the hyphenated Americans, I'm always reminded, though, of the great line from Yogi Berra when he was a spokesman for the drink Yoo-Hoo, and someone called the factory and asked, the business, and he picked up, and they were calling to find that if Yoo-Hoo was carbonated, if Yoo-Hoo was hyphenated, and he says, "No, ma'am, it's not even carbonated," was his line. But to be a Jew actually is to always maintain a hyphenated identity, actually, because of course Jews are supposed to be loyal to the country in which they find themselves, especially if that country is welcoming to them. And Jews have always been loyal to America that treated them as equals. And yet, the greatness of America actually lay in the fact that hyphenated Americans, as it were, is exactly what the American conception of liberty expects us to be. I cited in the book that one of the earliest members of my congregation, Jonas Phillips, when he wrote a letter to the Constitutional Convention, writing to complain. He wrote to complain. It's the first time in Jewish history that a Jew complains. In 1787, he complained that there were state laws that prohibited Jews from serving in state legislatures, in Pennsylvania especially. And he demanded equality. And he dated the letter. This was to the Constitutional Convention. He wrote something like 26 Elul, 55, with the Jewish state. And then he wrote September 1787. Who's he adding that Jewish date for? For George Washington? I mean, who's he writing it for? He adds the Jewish date, and then he's like, and if you want the Goyish date, here's the Goyish date. But he meant to say, of course, I'm not amputating this from who I am. And Brandeis meets this, a man who had been Herzl's secretary, who came to interview him about insurance law, not about Zionism. And separately, as they were driving, he was driving this man back to the station in Cape Cod. He says, this secretary, De Haas, Herzl's secretary, asked Brandeis, by the way, are you related to Louis Dembitz? And he says, yes, that was my uncle. I really admired him. And he says, well, Louis Dembitz was a very prominent Zionist. And that just inspires him to think this over. And he goes from that to effectively the American head of the Zionist movement by 1914. And then, while he's a Supreme Court justice, becomes one of the most significant lobbyers for the Balfour Declaration. If you can imagine nowadays a Supreme Court justice lobbying the president on anything. Imagine what the conspiracy theorists would say if they lobbied it on Israel. But he's lobbying on behalf of his people. And so his story is even more remarkable in a certain sense, because it's a chance conversation at a train that sets him on this course, a course in which he not only, I think, understood better what it meant at least to be part of the Jewish people, he also, I think, gained a deeper appreciation of what it means to be an American. And I think that's an absolutely amazing and, I believe, providential story.
Thank you. I have so many more questions, but I would like to share the floor with our audience. So we're going to pass around a mic. So we'll do a few questions, and then we're going to we'll have a book signing and a reception
and
following.
Sushi. I don't know if that was
And sushi.
mentioned, but yeah.
So we'll have to do quick questions so that we have time to get a few in.
Judging by the figures that you've cited, that you selected, it seems that two things are highlighted. Contradiction, the Jewish contradiction, the fundamental contradiction of being Jewish and Jewish in whatever state they're in. And then also the issue of there's internal politics and statesmanship, and there's external statesmanship, where Jews play a role outside of the Jewish experience and then play a role within the Jewish framework. Can you talk, I don't know what the question is exactly, but can you talk about that? I think that's seems to be
that's a great question. That's an excellent question, sir. Thank you. That question is especially relevant with the figures that represent the Jewish people at a time of Jewish powerlessness, which, of course, actually raises the question, what is Jewish statesmanship during a period of Jewish powerlessness? So that's certainly relevant to the sage Yochanan ben Zakkai, who effectively sets the course for rabbinic Judaism following the fall of Jerusalem. Talmud describes his lobbying Roman leadership for the right to create an academy in Yavne, but also for the right to keep alive the Jewish political structure that was linked to the house of Hillel, to the patriarchal house of Hillel. And so what those stories actually, from a study of statesmanship, are in a certain sense even more fascinating, because they focus on the statesman keeping in his or her mind both what is owed the Jewish people, but also how best to engage the non-Jewish political world. So whether you're Yochanan ben Zakkai, thinking both the question of how do I preserve Judaism after the worst event in its history, and also how do I flatter Roman authorities and impress them enough and ask for just enough because if I ask for too much, I may get nothing. And then, to give a different example, what does it mean to be Don Isaac Abarbanel, where you are in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella of Aragon and Castile, and you're lobbying for your people who are about to be expelled. And you are speaking simultaneously as statesman who has served in the courts of Portuguese and Spanish royalty, and also as one of the most brilliant exegetes and rabbis in Jewish history, as well as a descendant of King David. What does it mean to balance all that? And when do you focus on your gifts as a member of the court? And when do you focus on your Davidic heritage? And that's a question I tease out in the book. So in a certain sense, these are the most interesting statesmen of all, because at its core, statesmanship is an engagement with those in power on behalf of one's people. One can be the person in power, or one can be the representative of one's people, engaging those in power, whether you're Yochanan ben Zakkai or whether you're Theodore Herzl. And with figures like that, there is that delicate balance that you describe. And so not only do we see great exemplars of statesmanship, we see a certain depth and complexity that you won't necessarily find with a king of Israel in the Bible or a prime minister of Israel in modern times.
And we have time for one more question.
Rabbi, can we talk about the here and now for a second? I'm wondering about your reaction to the CUNY Law commencement speech.
That's not our subject, but obviously I would condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, and of course see in it a terrible warning sign and a danger sign of what exists in some realms of the academy, which is of course why I'm so honored and delighted to be hosted in Jennifer Rabb's Hunter College and to sing her praises. Maybe we'll take one more question about the book.
Yeah, let's do one more question
sense.
about
Yes.
the book.
Yes.
Here we go. There's a mic coming.
How do you see Jewish law affecting these leaders? Because some of them are borderline Reform, some are borderline Christian, some are very Orthodox. How do you think it seems to transform Jewish thought?
Yeah, so Jewish law plays a real role in some of the figures here. So when we talk about, and not just the rabbis. Obviously there is one central drama concerning conversion, which is when Isaac Abravanel is asked by the royal family to stay in Spain and to convert, which is exactly what one of the other leading Jews of the era, Abraham Signor, did. And of course, he famously refused, though everything would have been open to him. And I cite that as one of the greatest moments in his life. But Jewish law is, I think, one of the most interesting and undiscussed subjects in the story of Shlom Tzion. Because, of course, there is, on the one hand, these deep tensions within Judea at the time between Jews that are advancing different versions of Judaism, Pharisaic Judaism and then the Sadducees. But then, when Shlom Tzion becomes queen, it's at that point, during the era of the sage Shimon ben Shetach, that what is strengthened is at that moment is the protection of women in marriage. It's at that point that the ketubah is invented. And it's at that point that families are strengthened through the creation of incredible systems of education. And I theorize that what you have here is this incredible alliance between Shlom Tzion and rabbinic law that in protecting women in marriage and the Jewish family actually set the stage for the survival of Judaism in the much less good years that follow, because it's all downhill after Shlom Tzion passes away. The civil war between the Hasmoneans brings Rome into Judea, and then you know what happens next. So so you will find some that will make that for whom Jewish law plays very little role in their lives. And I theorize there that the remarkable nature of their story are themselves signs of providence. But the interesting fact is that it's actually as much as Rabbi Don Isaac Abravanel or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It is a Jewish queen that I think emerges as one of the great heroes of Jewish law, not just of the Jewish people in this book. And if in any way I can advance her legacy, that alone would be an achievement that would make me very happy.
So I want to thank you so much, and I hope that...
I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you. It means a lot to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And we're going to join Rabbi Soloveichik. We'll sign copies of this incredible book, so please purchase it, and he will sign it.
Unless you want to wait for the movie.
Unless you want to wait for the movie. Also, thank you. I forgot to thank Harold and the Roosevelt House for yet again hosting us, so thank you.
Thank you, Harold, for everything.